Part 13 of the Works of Sallust. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Alan Brown. Works of Gaius Sallustius Crispus, translated by Alfred W. Pollard. Jugurthine War, Part 4. As the eloquence of Memmius was at that period renowned and influential in Rome, I have thought it well to set forth one of his numerous speeches, and I shall report by preference one which he delivered at a public meeting after the return of Bestia, somewhat as follows. There is much, Romans, to dissuade me from espousing your cause, were it not that my patriotism is proof against every attack. There is the power of a cabal, your own submissiveness, the absence of justice, and above all, the fact that political honesty involves more danger than recognition. I refrain, for very shame, from dilating on how for the last 15 years you have been the sport of an arrogant faction, how your champions have perished shamefully and unavenged, how you have suffered cowardice and sloth to weaken your courage, and even now do not rise against your enemies, though they lie at your mercy, even now tremble before men who ought to tremble before you. All this is as I have said, and yet my spirit forces me to oppose the tyranny of the cabal. I, at least, will make use of the freedom which was bequeathed to me by my father, whether in vain or to some purpose, it lies with you to determine. I do not advise you to do as your ancestors often did, and to take up arms against your wrongs. There is no need for violence, no need for secession. Your enemies' own behavior is certain to work their ruin. After the murder of Tiberius Gracchus, whom they accused of aiming at kingly power, they set their commissions to work against the party of the commons in Rome. Again, after the slaughter of Gaius Gracchus and Marcus Fulvius, many men of your station were put to death in prison, and in neither case was it the law, but the victor's caprice that brought the massacre to an end. Let us grant, however, that to give the people back its own is equivalent to aiming at kingly power, and that deeds that cannot be avenged without bloodshed are constitutionally done. In former years you chafed in silence at the sight of the treasury being rifled, of kings and free people paying tribute to a clique of nobles, of the highest glory and the greatest riches being confined to them. Now, not satisfied with having committed these crimes with impunity, they have even presumed to betray to the enemy the laws, your dignity, things human and things divine, in fine, our all. And the men who have done these things feel neither shame nor repentance. They flaunt their splendor before your eyes, displaying their priesthoods and their consulships, and some their triumphs, as if they held them as honors to which they were entitled, not as spoils they had seized. Slaves that are bought for money rebel at unjust commands of their masters. Will you, Romans, who are born to rule, patiently submit to servitude? But what manner of men are these who have taken possession of the state? They are the most wicked of mortals, men of blood-stained hands and monstrous avarice, the most criminal and arrogant of their kind, men who would sell their word, their loyalty, their affections, and seek a profit alike from honor and from shame. Some of them find their safety in having murdered tribunes of the people, others in having held oppressive trials, many in the slaughter of your class. The worse their crimes, the greater their safety. The fears that they should feel for their own guilt, they have inspired in you in your cowardice. Common desires, common hatreds, and common fears have united them together in an alliance which between good men would be friendship, but between bad is a cabal. Were but your anxiety for your freedom equal to their zeal for power, the state would assuredly not be the prey it now is, and your benefits would be enjoyed by your best men, not by your boldest criminals. To win their rights and establish their dignity, your ancestors twice seceded in arms and seized Mount Aventine. Will you not strive to the utmost of your power to maintain the liberty which you received from them? Will you not strive for it with a vigour made fiercer by the thought that it is more shameful to lose a possession once won than never to have gained it? But what do you propose? Some one will ask me. Ought we to take vengeance on the men who have betrayed the state to its enemy? Not, I answer, by force or by violence, which is more disgraceful for you to use than for them to suffer, but by legal trial, and the witness of Jugurtha himself. For if he has really surrendered, he will undoubtedly pay obedience to your commands. If he despises them, you will know how to judge of the peace and surrender which has secured to Jugurtha impunity for his crimes, immense sums to a few powerful men, and to the state nothing but loss and dishonour. Perhaps, however, you have not even yet had enough of their tyranny, and like the present times, less than the days of old, when kingdoms and provinces, law, justice, and judgment, peace and war, and all things both human and divine, were held in the hands of a petty class, while you who are the Roman people, conquered by no enemy, the lords of every race, thought it enough if you kept your lives, for who among you dared to refuse the yoke of slavery? But despite my belief that for one who bears the name of man to sit quiet beneath a wrong is the deepest disgrace, I would yet be content that you should pardon these, the wickedest of their race, since they are your fellow citizens, were it not that your compassion would turn to your own destruction. So great is these men's shamelessness that it will not be enough that you have forgiven their offences in the past. You must also deprive them of the power of offending in the future. If you do not, you will be kept in constant anxiety, for you will discover that you must either submit to slavery or keep your freedom by means of force. Of force, I say, for what hope is there of mutual trust or concord? They wish to rule, you to be free; they to inflict wrong, you to prevent it, while finally they treat your allies as enemies and your enemies as allies. With purposes so different, can there be either friendship or peace? I therefore warn and urge you not to allow so great a crime to go unpunished. This is no case of fraud on the treasury, or of money extorted by force from your allies. Heavy crimes as these are, custom by this time has taught us to count them mere nothings. No, it is the powers of the Senate that have been sold to our bitterest enemy. Your sovereign rights have been betrayed, at home and abroad. Our country has been bought and sold. If these things be not inquired into, if the guilty go unpunished, what is there left for us but to live in bondage to the men who have done them? For what is kingship but the power to work your will with impunity? I do not, however, exhort you, Quirites, to be glad that fellow citizens have done the wrong rather than the right. I only exhort you not to set about destroying the good by pardoning the bad. In matters of state, I must add, it is much better to be forgetful of a service than of an injury. Neglect only makes the good man slower to serve you; it makes the bad worse than he was before. See to it that none do you wrong, and you will not often stand in need of others' help. By frequent speeches to this and the like effect, Memmius persuaded the people to dispatch Lucius Cassius, then praetor, to bring Jugurtha to Rome, pledging the public word for his safety, in order that by the king's testimony the misconduct of Scaurus and the others who were arraigned for receiving bribes might be more easily exposed. While this was going on at Rome, the officers left by Bestia in command of the army in Numidia committed many scandalous crimes in imitation of their general. Some, on receipt of bribes, restored his elephants to Jugurtha, Others sold him his deserters. Others again plundered friendly lands, so violent was the avarice which had settled like a plague upon their minds. Gaius Memmius carried his bill, and amid the dismay of the whole nobility, Cassius set out on his mission to Jugurtha. Finding the king full of fear, and prompted by his guilty conscience to despair, he persuaded him, since he had surrendered to the Roman people, not to prefer to learn their might rather than their clemency. For his safety, moreover, he privately pledged his own word, which such at that time was Cassius's reputation, the king valued as highly as that of the people. Jugurtha therefore came to Rome with Cassius, in a guise so pitiful as to be the very opposite of royal state. He had himself no lack of courage, and was supported by all those whose influence or crimes had enabled him to accomplish all that I have above narrated. Nevertheless, he bought with a great bribe Gaius Baebius, a tribune of the commons, thinking that by his shamelessness he would be protected against both justice and violence. A public meeting was summoned, and the commons showed themselves very hostile to the king, some bidding him be put in chains, others that punishment should be inflicted on him as an enemy, according to ancient custom, unless he revealed who were his accomplices. Gaius Memmius, however, had more regard for their dignity than their wrath, quieted their commotion, softened their passions, and finally protested that, as far as he was concerned, the public word should not be broken. As soon as silence was gained, he brought forward Jugurtha, and addressed him, reminding him of his misdeeds in Rome and Numidia, and laying before him the crimes he had committed against his father and brothers. The Roman people, he continued, were not ignorant as to who were his helpers and agents in all this. They wished, however, to have it somewhat more clearly stated from his own mouth. Should he reveal the truth, there rested a great hope for him in the honour and merciful disposition of the Roman people. Should he withhold the information, he would not save his accomplices, but would ruin himself and his own hopes. Memmius finished his speech, and Jugurtha was ordered to make answer, when Gaius Baebius, the tribune of the commons, whose corruption I have mentioned, ordered the king to be silent. And although the crowd, which was present at the meeting, in a frenzy of rage tried to terrify him by shouts, by gestures, by frequent assaults, and by every other ebullition which anger is wont to produce, his shamelessness nevertheless won the day. The people quitted the meeting where they had been thus mocked, and Jugurtha, Bestia, and the others whom the investigation was disquieting felt their courage increase. There was at this time in Rome a certain Numidian, by name Massiva, a son of Gulussa, and grandson of Massinissa. In the struggle between the kings he had opposed Jugurtha, and on the surrender of Cirta and the murder of Adherbal, had fled from his country into exile. Spurius Albinus, consul with Quintus Minucius Rufus, in the year after Bestia, now persuaded him, since he was of the stock of Massinissa, and Jugurtha, for his crimes, was loaded with odium and fear, to beg the kingdom of Numidia from the Senate. The consul was eager to conduct a war, and so preferred a general agitation to letting the matter lose its interest, for the province of Numidia had fallen to himself, that of Macedonia to Minucius. On Massiva beginning to stir in the matter, Jugurtha, who found no sufficient defence in his friends, some of whom were embarrassed by their consciousness of guilt, others by their ill repute or their own fears, ordered Bomilcar, his most intimate and trusty attendant, to employ the bribery by which he had accomplished so much, in hiring assassins to attack Massiva, and to kill the Numidian secretly if he could, or, failing this, by any means whatever. Bomilcar speedily carried out the king's commands, and by means of men skilled in such business gained information as to his victim's journeys and departures, and in fine as to all the places he was in the habit of frequenting, and the hours which he observed. He then directed the attack as the circumstances made advisable. One of the band who were hired to commit the murder rushed upon Massiva somewhat hastily, and though he cut him down, was himself seized. At the instance of many advisers, and especially of the consul Albinus, this man turned informer, and Bomilcar was made to stand a trial, rather on considerations of equity than by the law of nations, since he was in attendance on one who had come to Rome under the public guarantee. Though detected in so great a crime, Jugurtha did not abandon the struggle against facts until he perceived that the odium of his deed was too great for either influence or money to overcome. On the first hearing of the case he had given 50 sureties from among his friends, but now, thinking more of his kingdom than his sureties, he privily dispatched Bomilcar to Numidia, in the fear that, should he be punished, the rest of his accomplices might be seized with the dread of obeying him. A few days afterwards he himself set out on the same journey, as he was commanded by the Senate to leave Italy. When he had passed out of Rome, he is said, after often looking back on it in silence, at last to have cried, "A city for sale, soon to fall if once it find a buyer." Meanwhile the war had been resumed, and Albinus hastened to convey to Africa provisions and pay and other requisites for his soldiers' use. He himself set out immediately, hoping either by arms, a capitulation, or some other means to finish the war before the date of the elections, which was now not far distant. Jugurtha, on the other hand, pursued a policy of delay, assigning now one cause and now another, promising to surrender and then, pretending distrust, retreating before Albinus's advance, and a little while after to keep his followers from despair, himself advancing. Thus now by warlike, now by peaceful means, he secured delay and baffled the consul. Some at the time thought that Albinus was privy to the king's design, and refused to believe that a war so vigorously begun was thus easily prolonged by sloth rather than treachery. Anyhow, time slipped away, and the date of the elections drew near at hand. Albinus therefore left his brother Aulus as pro-praetor in the camp and departed for Rome. Just at this time at Rome, the state was being violently excited by dissensions among the tribunes, two of whom, Publius Lucullus and Lucius Annius, were striving, despite the opposition of their colleagues, to extend their term of office. This disagreement prevented the elections being held throughout the year, and Aulus, who, as I said above, had been left as pro-praetor in the camp, was led by this delay to entertain a hope of either bringing the war to an end, or extorting money from the king by the terror of his army. Summoning the soldiers from their winter quarters for a campaign in the month of January, he arrived by means of forced marches in most inclement weather at the town of Suthul, where the king's treasures were deposited. The bitterness of the season and the natural advantages of the place made its storm or blockade impossible. Around its wall, which lay on the edge of a steep cliff, a swampy plain had been turned by the rain into a lake. Yet Aulus, either as a pretense by which to increase the king's alarm, or blinded by his eagerness to gain the town for the sake of the treasures, brought up mantlets, threw up a rampart, and hastily made other provisions such as might forward his undertaking. Aware of the folly and unskilfulness of the legate, Jugurtha craftily fostered his madness, sent a succession of beseeching embassies, and, as if to avoid him, kept leading his army amid forests and bypaths. At last he enticed Aulus, by the hope of a secret agreement, to leave Suthul and follow him in his pretended retreat into remote regions. There his misconduct was to be more screened from observation. Meanwhile he employed skilful agents to tamper with the praetor's army night and day, and bribed the centurions and squadron leaders, some to desert, others at a given signal to abandon their post. When everything was arranged to his wish, in the dead of night he suddenly surrounded the camp of Aulus, with a host of Numidians. The Roman soldiers were panic-stricken by the unwonted uproar. Some seized their arms, others sought concealment, others again tried to encourage their frightened comrades. Everywhere there was confusion. The force of the enemy was large, the sky was darkened by night and clouds. Their danger was critical. It was doubtful whether to flee or to remain was the safer course. Of those whom I stated to have been recently bribed, one cohort of Ligurians, with 2 squadrons of Thracians and a few private soldiers, deserted to the king, and the chief centurion of the 3rd legion gave an entrance to the enemy over the rampart of which he had been entrusted with the defence. By this road all the Numidians burst into the camp. Our men, in a disgraceful rout, many of them, after throwing away their arms, gained a neighbouring hill. Night and the plunder of the camp withheld the enemy from making use of their victory. On the next day Jugurtha, in a conference with Aulus, expressed himself to the effect that, although he held him and his army in the toils of famine and sword, he was yet mindful of human fortunes, and if Aulus would enter into a treaty, would dismiss his whole force unharmed beneath the yoke, with the further stipulation that he was to leave Numidia within 10 days. The terms were grievous and shameful. Nevertheless, with the fear of death before their eyes, peace was concluded according to the king's pleasure. End of Jugurthine War, Part 4.